Seja bem-vindo à nossa conversa de hoje, onde nós vamos tentar trazer de forma prática a teologia para a nossa vida diária. Então, por isso, fique até o final, a gente vai discutir algumas coisas que vão parecer às vezes distantes da nossa realidade, mas no final a gente vai amarrar tudo isso aí, tá bom? Meu nome é Leonardo Campanha e hoje meu convidado é o Dr. Jonathan Gibson, professor de Teologia do Antigo Testamento aqui no Westminster. Vou deixar para ele se apresentar, o currículo é muito grande, eu não quero cometer nenhuma falha aqui, mas caso você esteja interessado, nós temos aí pelo menos 2 livros dele publicados em português, um no qual ele é editor, Do Céu, ele veio buscá-la, e o outro um livro com foco no público infantil, né? A Lua é sempre redonda, creio que vale a pena, um livro que fala sobre a soberania de Deus, a bondade de Deus e em meio ao sofrimento humano. Então, creio que fica aí o nosso convite a você e ao nosso alerta às editoras, né? Tem vários livros dele que ainda não foram publicados em português. Mas para aproveitarmos bem o nosso tempo aqui, vamos conversar então a nossa conversa com o Dr. Gibson. Dr. Gibson, just did a short introduction because I want to use our time wisely. So it's a huge privilege to have you here in our first episode of this podcast. And I appreciate all the effort you put into making this happen. Thank you a lot for that. And even your willingness to be part of it, just to participate. I'm really happy because of that. So I'm excited because I think this podcast will be a blessing for people in Brazil and today with no boundaries with internet all over the world, right?
Yeah.
So let's...
Good to join you, Leo, on this podcast.
So let's begin. Tell us a little about your family, your ministry, your academic background. I didn't want to do that, so
married to Jackie. We have 4 children, Benjamin, Layla, Zachary, and Hannah. Our second child, our daughter Layla's in heaven. A very sad providence. 7.5 years ago, she died as a stillborn, full-term baby. So we have 4 children, 3 here, 1 waiting for us in heaven. I'm an ordained Presbyterian minister in the International Presbyterian Church in the UK, a denomination that was founded by Francis Schaeffer in 1954 in Europe. That's where I'm ordained, in the British Presbytery in the UK. I did a PhD in Hebrew studies at Cambridge University in the book of Malachi. I then became an ordained minister in Cambridge and served in a church for 2.5 years, and then came to America nearly 7 years ago to teach Old Testament here at Westminster Theological Seminary.
Okay, that's good. So, you are like an Old Testament professor, right? So, thinking about the Old Testament, especially about Genesis today. So, what is the importance of this book for the Christian faith?
So, it's important for a number of reasons. It's clearly the foundation of the whole Bible, and it's the foundation of Christian theology as well. It gives us our foundations for understanding who God is, who we are in His world. It's also the beginning of the Bible's story. You know, the Bible is a story from creation to new creation via the cross and resurrection. And this book gives us the beginning of that story. I also like to teach my students here at Westminster that, in a sense, the whole Bible is contained in the book of Genesis, or even, I would say, in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. There's a sense in which the whole story of the Bibles is in those 3 chapters. And in a sense, nothing new is added after the 3 chapters of Genesis, except that the information that is there just becomes expanded. It grows organically, like a little seed that is planted, turns into a shoot, then into a tree in full blossom. That seed contains all the DNA that is needed for the seed to grow from a seed to a big tree in full blossom. And that's a bit like the early chapters of Genesis. They contain all the seed information for the rest of the Bible story to develop. So I think that's why it's important as Christians to understand the book of Genesis.
So consider this, like the importance of these first chapters, like you said. I think like Voss's idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
This development of the God's revelation. Uh, there have been like a lot of debates about how we should understand these first 3 chapters of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So consider just the first and the second. I think the third is like included in this discussion. What is the literary type of these first chapters of Genesis?
Yeah, so that's one area where the debate is the literary type of Genesis chapter 1 to 2 3, the Genesis prologue. Is it prose? Is it like historical narrative, or is it poetry? Is it like one of the Psalms, for example? Well, we can do statistical analysis actually on the Hebrew text, and there are things called prose particles. They are the definite article, hey. There is the relative pronoun, asher. There is the direct object marker, et. In the Hebrew, these are classic distinctive marks of prose. In poetry, they tend to drop off because you're trying to say something in a short, a pithy or terse way. And so they often drop the definite article, drop the relative pronoun, drop the direct object marker. And scholars have done statistics on what a normal Hebrew prose text will contain of prose particles. It's about 15% or more to make it Hebrew prose. And poetry, it's less than 5% of the number of words in any given poem. Well, the prose particles in the Genesis prologue, Genesis 1 to 2 3, is 24.4% of all the words. So
A little higher.
well over the 15%. But it's not just that. The Genesis prologue, it doesn't have the Hebrew parallelism that is so distinct about Hebrew poetry. There's a bit of alliteration at the very beginning. There is definitely the rhythm and cycle of the pattern of phrases, and God said, and it was so, and there was evening and there was morning, the first day, the second day, etc. But you can have that in historical prose. We might call this heightened prose or highly stylized prose, but it is still prose. And so it's history. And there's no change between Genesis 1, 2, 3, from 2, 4 on, and even from 3 on, and even from chapter 12 on. People often say Genesis 1 to 11 is like proto-history. It's like poetry. It's like war songs, war poems that we wouldn't take literally, but they still refer to a true event that happened. But you can't really say that about Genesis 1 to 11. The Hebrew is just the same as Genesis 12 through to 50.
So I think in Brazil we would say like it's a prose with a touch of poetry.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say a touch of poetry.
Okay.
I would just say prose, highly shaped, carefully shaped,
Okay.
with a rhythm to it. That, yeah, I wouldn't even say it's poetic or semi-poetic.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, that's good.
Mm.
So in which way like this literary type helps us to understand, to approach the creation account?
Mm.
I think there's like huge debate about the creation days, all these things.
Mm-hmm.
How this literary types helps us to understand that?
Well, the first thing I would say is we should not pit literary against literal.
Okay.
Okay, I don't know how you would say that in Portuguese, but you don't want to pit literary against literal. The Psalms, for example, are very literary. They're shaped a certain way, like Psalm 104, for example. But Psalm 104 recalls the events of the creation account, and generally in the order in which they happened. And so we would never say that Psalm 104 is just an imaginary poem about creation. We would say it's written in poetry, it's got the parallelism, it's got rhyme, it's got alliteration, all of those things we would affirm in it, while at the same time saying it's referring to real events. God made the trees, God made the mountains, God made the birds and the fish. So we shouldn't pit literary against literal. So even if Genesis 1 to 2, 3 was poetic or semi-poetic, that doesn't mean it didn't happen that way. So that's the first thing I would say. Let's not pit literary against literal. The second thing I would say is, because it's historical narrative, because it's prose, then we should read it as true history, real history. There is a genre, a literary type in the Old Testament and in the New Testament where things are not to be taken literally. It's called apocalyptic literature. In Daniel, you have these beasts with two heads, and you have the same in Revelation. You have a lion that looks like a lamb, and you're like, well, is it a lion or a lamb? Well, it's both. And so it's very symbolic language, and it's not to be taken literally. It's pointing to something. Well, Genesis 1:1-2:3 is not like that. It's not apocalyptic. But again, even if it was poetry, we shouldn't pit literary against literal.
So, so what are your thoughts about the reason for the existence of so many understandings about these days of creation? And if you can just give us like a brief summary of the main lines of interpretation.
So I think there's about 9 different views that I think you can discern in the literature now. Some of them overlap with each other, but I think there's about 9 or so main interpretations. Since the early church, people like Origen, Augustine, Anselm in the medieval period, they have read Genesis 1 as figurative. But in fairness to someone like Augustine, he was trying to grapple with the text, saying that there seems to be some tension in the text. Genesis 2:4 says, in the day that the Lord God made the heavens and the earth. Well, that sounds like he made them all in one day, in one moment. And Augustine says, well, if he made them all in one day, as chapter 2, verse 4 says, that means these other 6 days can't all be 24-hour days. So he then said, well, they must all have been made in an instant. So he collapses the 6 days into one moment, into the instant. He also read, the first half of chapter 1, got to day 4 with the creation of the sun, and said, well, if the sun was made on day 4, that created normal 24-hour days. Well, that would mean days 1-3 could not be normal 24-hour days. And so he said, what kind of days these are, we will never know. But he was really talking about the first 3 days in that respect, though he then said all 6 days are figurative. Now, people like Augustine in the early church, they were rare. The majority view was the literal 24-hour day view, and you can see this throughout the literature. Same for the medieval people. Peter Lombard, Thomas Aquinas spoke about ordinary days, 24 hours. The reformers, every single reformer to a man, 24-hour days. Post-Reformation period, Turretin, Van Maastricht, all these guys, John Owen, normal 24-hour days. And then comes the Enlightenment. I should say Jewish scholarship, medieval, all normal 24-hour days, generally speaking. Then comes the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, where now man knows better than God, how the world came about, etc. And then you have Darwin's theory of evolution, 1853, is it? The origin of species. And not just Darwin, but a number of other scientists writing in universities in Great Britain and starting to give a paradigm shift to how we should understand the earth, the age, the origin of mankind, the number of species, whether such a thing as macroevolution exists, etc. And at that time, the church felt the tension between what the world was saying and what the church was saying, and it was at odds. And so the church over the years sought to find an accommodation to these scientific discoveries, thinking they were fact, and so started to try to adapt the Bible. And not going with Augustine and instantaneous, they went with long ages. We need to increase the age of the universe, of the world. And so you get theories like the day age interpretation, where each day corresponds to an age, a geological age like the Ice Age or the Iron Age or the Bronze Age. Others said that the days of creation are revelation days. They're 24-hour days in the Hebrew text, and what it's saying is that God revealed to Adam in 24 hours how he made the things he made on day one. So they're not creation days, they're revelation days. Others have said there's a gap in time between verses 1 and 2 and verse 3, that there was this period of time when the earth was void and empty, was formless and empty, and that shows us there was some kind of catastrophe, there was some kind of judgment by God. Maybe the dinosaurs were eliminated at that point. And so between verses 1 and 2 of Genesis and verse 3, we can introduce a gap. We don't know how long that was, but it allows for an old age, an old universe. That's called the gap theory. Others said, no, these are 24-hour days, but they didn't happen exactly the next day. There was 24 hours of creative activity by God, and then he took a millions of years period of rest. Then he stepped in again, did another 24-hour days of creation, and continued like that. It's called progressive creationism. It's sort of it can merge with the gap theory. And then there is the literary framework, best known by Meredith Kline and Lee Irons here in the States. Henri Blocher holds to it as well. This view says, if you look at the days of creation, they actually match up. Day 1 and day 4 match because it's both about light. Day 2 and day 5 match because it's about seas and land, water and land, and we've got fish and birds. Day 2 is about atmosphere, and we've got birds flying in the atmosphere, and there's also the waters that are separated below and above, and so, excuse me, the fish are swimming in those waters. And then day 3, the land appears and vegetation appears, but also animals appear on the land and mankind. And so you can match the days, either 3 days of forming, 3 days of filling the spheres, or the literary framework really says 3 kingdoms: the kingdom of light, the kingdom of water and sky, the kingdom of land, and God gives kings for each of those: the sun and moon to rule the day, the birds to rule the sky, the fish to rule the sea, the animals to rule the land, and man to rule over all the animals on the land. And so that's called the literary framework. And the key elements of that is it is non-literal days. These are not real days. These are literary days conveyed like they are 24-hour days, but in reality, they are not literal 24-hour days. And the second thing is they are not sequential days. Day 1 and day 4 are actually the same day. So you shouldn't read the narrative in a sequential way. So that's the literary framework. The analogical framework, it's not dissimilar to the literary framework. It says they're not literal days, they're analogical days. They're written like 24-hour days, but they refer to long, undefined periods of time in which God, in divine time, created these things. But the difference with the literary framework is that it's sequential. The analogical view says the 7 days do run one after another, but they refer to long, indefinite periods of time. And then the 7th day is an eternal day that goes on forever. That's the analogical view. The liturgical view, it's very like the analogical and literary. It just thinks these days are liturgical days, days of worship that are influenced by the Jewish Levitical calendar, and that the Sabbath is the big festival day each week. And so it's really the literary framework and a bit of the analogical in a liturgical garb, liturgical clothes. And then the last one is the literal interpretation, that these are ordinary days, 24-hour days. I don't like to say 24-hour days because you really only get 24 hours when the sun comes on day 4. But they're days of equal length, ordinary days, and they're literal, they're historical, and they show that God made the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day he began his eternal rest. But the 7th day is an ordinary day, And so the cycle of the week kicked in at the end of the first Sabbath. So that's the literal interpretation. So those are all the interpretations. To answer your question, why do I think there are so many?
Yeah.
Because of the Enlightenment. Augustine had his view, figurative. It was a minority view in the church. It never really gained ground. The Westminster Confession of Faith speaks against it when it puts in the phrase, in the space of 6 days. The Westminster Divines were trying to counter the Augustinian view. They said, no, we must have a space, a period of time in which creation took place, and it was 6 days. Why the proliferation of views? I think it's because science came along with its interpretation of the age of the earth, and the church has been trying to adapt to the science, which I think is a problem.
Yeah. Science or pseudoscience, right? This kind of tension we have until to this day, right?
So which science are we talking about?
Yeah.
That's the other issue. Often Christians say, there's no science and Christian faith are not enemies, they're friends. And my response is yes, but which science are you talking about?
Yeah.
Which science are you trying to reconcile with the Bible? Because there is anti-God science, there's an atheistic science, there's science that's done by the non-Christian in which their presupposition begins with an anti-God, anti-supernaturalistic philosophy. And that then influences how they think the world came about and how old it is.
In a sense, they are trying to defeat the Christian view of world, right? In a sense, I think they are trying to do that. So, all things considered, which one of these views do you think is the right one and why?
Yeah, so I think the literal interpretation view is the right one. It's the traditional view in the Christian church, at least up until the Enlightenment. And even since then, I think there's always been a segment of the church, even in the modern day, that holds to the traditional view, and that is the literal view. I think there are too many problems with the other ones. Yes, there's maybe some questions need to be answered, even with the literal day, about the sun being created on day 4, the 4th day. But the other ones are, I'll put it like this, the other ones, when you look at them, they're either so complex and so complicated to understand that what we're really saying is that a child cannot understand the first chapter of the Bible until they're at least a teenager and at school have done geology or science or understand literary frameworks in literature or understand the argument of what an analogy is, the analogical view. Liturgical, if you don't understand the liturgy of Leviticus, then you won't understand Genesis 1. And what it really is saying is the first chapter of the Bible was inspired by the Holy Spirit in a way that is a mystery to us, and children, and not just children, uneducated people in third world countries will never really understand Genesis. But read Genesis to a child, or let a child at 6, 7, 8 read Genesis chapter 1. And what will they tell you about the creation week? They'll tell you God made the world in 6 days. And you say, do you mean 6 days like in our week? Yeah, that's what it sounds like. What we're really then saying to them is, well, I'll wait till you get it better educated, and then I'll tell you what it really means. Because you're too young or you're too uneducated to really know what this means. So that is one of my first problems or main problems with it. With the alternative views. They're too complex, too highly sophisticated to convey the simple truth that God made the world in 6 days. But for me also, there's the genre, there's the ordinal numbers. He doesn't say day 1, day 2, day 3. He says the first day, the second day, the third day. So it's the language of sequence. That's why I don't think the literary framework's very good. And I think these alternative views really undermine the historicity of the creation week. Now, proponents of the literary framework and the analogical will say, no, we agree that it was historical time. We just don't know what kind of time it was, right? It was divine time. It is upper register time, as Klein calls it. but we don't know what kind of time it was, but it was real history. And I say, okay, that's fine. It's real history. And day 7 is an eternal day. And if that's still real history, then we are still in the eternal day. When did the ordinary week kick in? When did the ordinary day begin? When did the ordinary Sabbath begin in Israel's history? If you hold to one of these views saying it's not time as we know it, it was time as God knew it in history, then my question is, when was the first ordinary day in history? When was the first ordinary week in history? When was the first ordinary Sabbath in history? Now, when you read Exodus chapter 16, when they're collecting the manna in the wilderness, before the 10 Commandments have been given, before God says, remember the Sabbath, and notice he says, remember the Sabbath, so they already know about the Sabbath. But in Exodus chapter 16, he says, collect the bread for 6 days, but not on the 7th day, which is a Sabbath. Now, if you don't think the first Sabbath in Genesis 2, 1-3 is the first ordinary historical Sabbath day in the history of the world, the question is, when did the Sabbath begin? When was the first ordinary Sabbath? If it wasn't the one in the creation week, when was it? And if somebody says, well, it doesn't really matter. But it does matter. All redemptive history is shaped around the week. A 6-day working week with the 7th day as a Sabbath. And you see the number 7 come up with the Noahic flood narrative. You see it with the plagues. You see it with walking around the walls of Jericho. The number 7 is important. And you also see it with the life of Christ when he dies, the week in which he dies and rises again. The events happen strategically within the week. He dies on a Friday, the last day, the 6th day of a working week. And he says in the afternoon of the last day of a working week, it is finished. And then he sleeps through the Sabbath on the Saturday, and then he rises again on Sunday morning, which is the first day of the week. And what did God do on the first day of creation? He said, let there be light. And there was light. So Jesus dies on the same day that Adam was created. Some people believe Adam fell on the Friday as well, which I'm starting to quite like that idea. We'll never know, but he at least died on the day Adam was created. He may have died on the day Adam sinned, which makes even more sense because he's paying the penalty for Adam's sin. He sleeps through the Sabbath in the old dispensation, and he rises on the first day of a new week. Well, you can now see how theologically rich his death, burial, and resurrection are in relation to the ordinary week. So the ordinary week, the 6-day plus 1 week, is so significant to redemptive history. But if you hold to one of these alternative views, you cannot give an explanation or an answer for the origination of that ordinary week in history. You have to say, well, it just sort of started at some point, right? And so I think there are problems with it. I think the most simple, straightforward reading of Genesis 1:1-2:3 is that God made the world in 6 ordinary... I think the most simple, straightforward explanation of Genesis 1:1-2:3 is that God made the world in 6 ordinary days that were sequential, and that he rested on the 7th day. On that day, he entered his own eternal rest to never do the work of creation again. But that 7th day ended, and the next day began as the first day of a working week for Adam and Eve. And I think God stitched in the ordinary week, ordinary day, ordinary week, ordinary Sabbath at the very beginning of creation, and that Genesis 1:1-2:3 records that for us. And then that makes the most sense of Exodus chapter 16. Don't take the manna on a 7th day because it's a Sabbath. It makes most sense of Genesis 20. Remember the Sabbath because it's already been established at creation. And then Moses mentions 4 in 6 days, God made the world and everything in it. That's why you're to work for 6 days and rest for one day. The analogy there is between workers. God was a worker. He worked and then he took a rest. We are workers. We're to work for 6 days and then take a rest. The analogy is not between days. It's not an analogy between divine days in which God worked at creation and human days in which we work. The days are identical. It's the exact same kind of day. What's the analogy is between God and us and his rest and our rest.
So when you are talking about being, you must be educated to understand some views. You must have this scientific mind of this kind of stuff. And I was thinking, what about the Jews? What about the God's people when they first received this text?
They were slaves in Egypt.
Yeah,
They'd had no education.
So they could understand, right?
Mm-hmm. If this was a sophisticated way of understanding the first chapter of the Bible, it would have been lost on them because they were slaves for 400 years. They were not going to school. They were not being educated like the Egyptians were, and the Egyptians were well educated. They had their astrology, they had manufactured amazing buildings for the pharaohs. But the Jews basically made brick and mortar and built things for the pharaohs, But they did understand the simple reading of Genesis or the oral story of it. They would have understood that no problem because they know what an ordinary day is.
And they were like the first audience, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what we're really saying, if you hold to one of these other alternative views, what you're also really saying is that the Jews at the time, maybe they didn't really understand it.
They didn't get it.
Yeah. Or you have to say, no, they really did believe that these were day ages, or that there was a gap between this period and this period, or that God worked for 24 hours and then took a break for millions of years, or that you got to understand the literature, match the days. The Jews were thinking of a literary framework, But if that's the case, why did Moses write the days as ordinal days? If day 1 and day 4 are the same day,
why this division?
Why use first and fourth? Why not use day 1, day 2? That's not actually how the text reads.
Yeah. So probably you don't remember that, but I think my first contact with you was like 2 years ago. I think first lunch we had here after some chapel, something like that. And I was like first year, like Brazilian. I was scared about the English stuff. And remember we were talking, you were like teaching this class to some of like third-year guys, something like that. And we started talking about the days of creation and all these, understandings. And so one of the topics we talked, and I think that's what I want to bring here right now, is like, is there any risk for those that don't adopt this view of like literal days of creation? What are the risks about these other views?
So let me say, having critiqued those other views, I don't think you go to hell or you lose your salvation if you hold to an alternative view. I want to be clear. I think Augustine will be in heaven. I think Meredith Kline will be in heaven. But that said, I don't think we should think it's unimportant, that it doesn't really matter. I think it does matter. And what I tell my students is that the way you interpret the first chapter of the Bible will determine how you interpret the rest of the Bible. And if you have a disposition toward wanting to accommodate to the latest scientific theory and consensus, you're going to do that with other parts of the Bible. And in church history, we've seen this. One generation start to question the days of creation, right? A few generations later, they start to question the historicity, or better, the originality of Adam. Okay? And then they start to doubt whether Noah's flood really happened, or whether it was a global flood or a local flood. Whether they doubt whether Jonah really was swallowed by a big fish. What you start to do is you start to open up
in question.
to a way of interpreting the Bible, a disposition toward the Bible that says, I can sit above the Bible and try and work out what I can reconcile with science or with the latest theory in philosophy or something. And so your attitude to the Bible, very subtly, may just start to be a little bit off. And you know what they say, a spacecraft traveling into space off its trajectory, off its path by 1 degree at the beginning, when it reaches the end, it'll be nowhere near the destiny that it was supposed to reach.
They'll be lost.
Yeah. And so we shouldn't think that this is a small issue. We want to get it right. And the second thing is, I say to my students that what you don't want to do is say, well, I'm agnostic about the first chapter of the Bible. I don't know. We'll never know. And I say to them, well, do you think God wants you as a minister of his word to begin your ministry, if you start preaching on Genesis, to say from the very get-go, okay, welcome to church today, but listen, we're going to look at a part of the Bible which we will just never know what it meant. Do you know?
Yeah.
And so I say to them at seminary, work out what you believe on Genesis 1. Like, if you really believe it's literal, preach like you believe it's literal. If you believe it's analogical or literary, preach like you believe it, you know, so that at least you give your people confidence that you take the first chapter of the Bible seriously, you know. What I was going to say was, church history now shows if you play around with the literal interpretation, I've said it, if you play around with the literal interpretation, you then play around with a literal Adam and whether he was made from the dust of the earth or not. You know, if we play around with the meaning of day, we'll play around with the meaning of man. And where are we today in the church? We are in a church where we can't even define what a man is or what a woman is. You know, the culture around us, and even the church is starting to get influenced by some of this.
This is the tension of our days, right?
Mm-hmm. And so where does it go back to? It goes back to Genesis. You know, God made 2 genders, not 3 or multiple genders. He made 2. How do we know that? Well, because he made a man and a woman, literally made them in the beginning, from the dust of the earth and from a rib from Adam. So we need to recover the historicity and originality of these early chapters of Genesis.
So we've been talking about this importance of getting Genesis 1 and 2 and even 3 in a historical way, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are the risks about just, I don't believe that Adam is a historical character. I don't believe that it was like a real man. I think it's kind of fiction. And God used like poetry to explain like from dust and all these things.
Yeah, so was Adam a myth or a man? Was he a metaphor or a man?
And just to add a second question to that, is if I don't believe that Adam is like a real man, is there any impact on our understanding of sin and redemption?
Mm-hmm. So as with the days of creation, I said that if you don't hold to the literal, you're not about to go to hell. Mm-hmm. With Adam, I think it's different.
Okay.
With Adam, I would say, if you don't believe in a real Adam in a garden who fell into sin at a tree, then I'm not sure you believe in sin as the Bible defines it. And if you don't believe in sin as the Bible defines it, do you believe in Jesus, the second and last Adam, as the Apostle Paul calls him, who died on a tree physically because the first Adam, by a tree, had brought physical death into the world? Now you can see that the 2 Adams cannot be separated. Okay, the gospel requires a belief in both Adams, that we really need the first Adam in order to understand the work of the second Adam. And we see all the connections, you know. Adam is naked by a tree, falls into temptation and succumbs to sin. Christ is naked on a tree. He resisted all of his temptations, even the last temptation to come down from the cross. He has on his head a crown of thorns. The first Adam brought a crown of thorns into the world from the sin. And this Adam, the second and last Adam, doesn't. What does Jesus say to the thief on the cross? Today you will be with me in paradise. Adam had been placed in a paradise, but because of his sin, he was thrust out of the paradise. Here's the second and last Adam bearing the curse of that sin, symbolized by the crown of thorns on his head, and inviting a sinner, a thief, into his paradise in heaven. So you can see the parallels. And it's not just a literary parallel. It's not just a mere symbolic parallel. Like you can say, just like Aslan in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, just like Aslan died on the stone table, so Christ died on a cross. Well, that doesn't carry any weight or any argument. That means Jesus maybe wasn't real. It's just a story. You need an historical Adam who fell into sin and brought the metaphysical reality of sin and death into the world, as Romans 5 tells us, through one man. Sin entered the world and death through sin, and therefore all have death comes to all because all have sinned. So you need Adam. And then Romans 5, you need Christ, the second and last Adam. Through one man's obedience, he has brought life, justification, righteousness. And so the way I put it is, we sometimes might say, no Jesus, no gospel. That's so true. I would say, no Adam, no gospel. Okay, you need the first Adam in order to preach the gospel about the second Adam.
Yeah, I think one book that's really helpful, I think Crow's book, right? The Last Adam.
Mm-hmm.
I've been reading this book like for a week.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting, like all these connections.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think now we are going to the end.
Mm-hmm.
So to wrap up this conversation, how can this truth help believers daily? So in which way can these understandings of like historical days and historical Adam help encourage people in their daily lives? Sometimes just it seems that's so distant for our daily struggles and all of this. How does this impact their lives? Our lives, actually.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is, it reminds us that there is a God who was there before the beginning. He is the eternal God. And he's the maker of all things. And so it reminds us, as creatures in his world, we ought to worship him and return to him in repentance and with thankfulness in our hearts for being our creator. It also teaches us that the world in which we live is the world God made in the very beginning. Nothing's changed. He made the heavens and the earth. And you look above you and you see the sky heavens, the starry heavens, and you see the earth and you see the land and you see the waters which are now seas, and you see the vegetation and you see the birds flying and you see the fish swimming and you see the creepy crawlies on the land and you see man ruling, and you think, we live in the world that Genesis speaks about. It's not that foreign. It's actually the same world. And as a parallel, we live in the same time. We have, across the world, a 7-day week. We work for 6 days and we have a day off. And so we are still in the created time cycle that God made. And so the question is, what are we going to do on his Sabbath? Yeah. God made the Sabbath as a time of rest, but also worship. And for the Jewish people in the Old Testament, that was the last day of the week. For the Christians, it's now the first day of the week, because that's the day of the week on which Jesus rose from the dead. And that is now called the Christian Sabbath or the Lord's Day. And so the question is, what are you going to do on that day? Right? You were made by God, the maker of heaven and earth, in his image, male and female. You were made to worship him on his day. That day is now a Sunday, the day Jesus rose from the dead. So what are you going to do on it? Are you going to come and worship your creator and your redeemer? Or are you going to ignore him and go your own way like Adam and Eve did? So I think, it communicates those kinds of realities to us, created realities in the physical space and in the temporal framework of the world. And then it also points us to the new creation. I think that chapter 1 of Genesis has a number of things that are eschatological. They point us to the last things. There is a heavens and an earth in the new heavens and the new earth. The alternating light on day 1, when God says, let there be light, and there was light, and it alternated between light and darkness. What is that light? Well, as a literal creationist, it's not the sun. And scientists now tell us there is light beyond the sun. I think it was another source of light, which is still working in our universe today. The scientists say there's still light beyond the sun. If you switch the sun off, there would still be some light. I think it's that light, but it's alternating. It's not an eternal light. It comes and it goes because of the rotation of the earth. And how does Revelation end? In that city, in that temple, there was no need for a sun, because the Lord God is the sun. And I think this light, maybe it was the light of God himself, or if it was a created light, it was pointing us to a light beyond the sun. It was pointing us to God himself. And it was showing us that there's coming a day when light and darkness will no longer alternate. It will only be light. There will be no darkness at all. And so I think those kind of aspects of Genesis 1 can orientate us there. Pastorally, I like to say Genesis 1:1 teaches us that in the beginning God made everything. And when you look at how Psalm 121 picks that up, I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth, the Lord who made heaven and earth. You realize he can help me with anything because he made everything. And so I think there's some lovely pastoral comforts in Genesis chapter 1. God can help us with anything because he made everything. And then also the order of there was evening and there was morning. The whole chapter is orientated towards the morning, towards light on a new morning. And I think that points us forward to the resurrection morning, when the light of the gospel started to shine in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. So now I think just give your final thoughts and I'll rest for just like this lecture we just had.
Well, I would encourage people to read Genesis and read it at face value, right? Just read it simply and plainly and see what those early chapters start to show you about God, about the world, about you as a human being made in his image. And ask God to speak through Genesis, because there are the created elements at the beginning, but there's also the good news of the gospel in Genesis 3:15, that God promised to send a son of the woman, an offspring of the woman who would crush the serpent. And that promise is about Jesus Christ. And the rest of the Old Testament is the organic development of that promise. So I'd encourage people to begin where the Bible begins and read Genesis.
Okay. And do you want to talk or say something about Westminster? So for our folks in Brazil.
Yeah, so for the folk in Brazil, if you want to come study at Westminster, we would love to have you. People like Leo have been here. We've had other Brazilians, Bruno and Felipe, and other folk from Brazil. And I think the best way to do theological education is in person, as you know from experience, Leo. So come study the Masters of Divinity or the MAR or the Masters in Counseling. Come and study that. If you can't come, then there are some online courses that can be done, and you can go to westminsterwts.edu, to our website, and find out about that. But we have lots of resources. You can go to our YouTube channel and watch our chapel services. But if this is the sort of thing that gets you really interested, then why not think of coming? Yeah. And I think Leo can speak and say that you will not regret coming.
No, I don't. And the Lord provided. Because sometimes the most difficult part is like finances.
Mm-hmm.
And the Lord has blessed us like so many ways.
Yeah, great. Well, it's been lovely to talk to you, Leo.
Oh, thank you so much for your time and all the effort. Again, thank you so much. E muito obrigado por vocês que acompanharam, tiveram paciência aqui ao longo do episódio. Espero que você tenha sido abençoado como eu fui e tenho sido abençoado por esse homem de Deus ao longo desses 2 anos que eu tenho estado aqui. Fica com Deus e até a próxima.